I thought I'd have a short sort of lecture on the Pelavan reading on Homo sapiens to put it into sort of a context, at least my context, of Generation P, as this book, Homo sapiens, was originally titled when it was published in Russia. And just sort of think about some ideas about Pepsi, Pelavan, and brand essence, or I guess is how Pelavan would say it, that man is wow to man, or wow, wow, wow. Victor Pelavan, he's considered to be one of the best known and favorite authors of Russia for the late 20th and early 21st century. And he's a Muscovite, and Moscow is his home, and you might want to think about that when you're reading his book, because Moscow is clearly a character in Homo sapiens. He's among the 3 best-selling Russian authors, and he's the only Russian East European to make the New Yorker's the year 2000 list of Europe's top 6 contemporary authors. Generation P was first published in 1999, and Homo sapiens is its translation. It sold more than 400,000 copies in 2004. There's an interesting article in Russian Life, the November-December 2004 edition, if you can get your hands on it, about Pelavan. He's sort of an elusive, mysterious person. He tends to sort of hide from the limelight. But to try to think about the importance of Pelavan and what he's trying to express in this generation, I think a couple of quotes, a couple of items. Lev Danilkin of Afisha magazine wrote, "It was Pelavan who explained what was happening in actual fact at the end of the 1980s and at the beginning and the end of the 1990s in Oman Ra, Chapayev, and Generation P." So I think that's a question to kind of think about. If Pelavan's books are portraits of their time, what does this time look like? What does Pelavan do, and how does he depict Moscow? And Pelavan's work has been considered to be an example of Russian postmodernism. It is a reaction against both Russian and Soviet modernism, and also plays with it's sort of it is a witty mockery of the Soviet meta-narratives. And so postmodernism, which is it's a very complicated idea, and I'm going to introduce it in one slide and leave it at that. The postmodernism challenge is there's no grand narrative or big historical process, in that there's no sort of truth with a capital T, or trying to really understand what the world is around you, because it sort of shifts. There's this postmodernism relies on hyper-awareness and radical skepticism, and I think this comes through very clearly in Victor Pelavan's Homo sapiens. Again, language is the key to all experience, and you can see how Pelavan really plays around with language. So you can maybe sort of stop and read this over more carefully, but one of the things I find interesting in terms of postmodernism is the work done by Jean Baudrillard, a French thinker. And if you're interested in postmodernism, Simon Malpas's Reader, The Postmodern, I think is very helpful. But anyway, this French postmodern theorist emphasized that the world had become hyper-realized. And I think that Pelavan's Homo sapiens is a really good example of this hyper-realized reality and what this means, sort of fantastical creations of media and technologies that have become more real than previous realities. So this created reality is more real than what was real. And, I think you can see this with this sort of enhanced reality that we use with technology now. And it's a very bleak view that Jean Baudrillard, I don't know how you're going to say his name, he argues is essentially that contemporary society has been been replaced with this hyper-real reality, and it has led to sort of this critical distance and this sort of creation of a counterfeit reality. And you think about that, I think that comes through pretty clearly in Victor Pelevin's Homo Sapiens, of sort of what is real and what is not real, or what is more real. And in Malpass's Postmodern Reader, he points to Disneyland as sort of the quintessential hyperreality, where your Disneyland hyperreality experience is more real than the experience of going to Europe itself and seeing the Eiffel Tower. And I think you get this sense of this hyperreality through Victor Pelevin's books, but also this quintessential hyperreality of Moscow itself. It seems hyper-real when you have together this center of power with this Lenin mausoleum and this amazing St. Basil's cathedral that just create a whole different kind of meta-narrative, I guess. So in a sort of hyper-realized, you see this with Homo Sapiens in terms of advertising, of the ability to create hyper-reality through advertising, making Stalin become the polar bear for the Coca-Cola ad, or that Lenin can hold a Coca-Cola. When you're rushing for a drink, there's no time for Stalin. So I think one of the key ideas in Victor Pelevin's Homo Sapiens is this sort of selling of an identity, of selling this Russian idea and this hyper-reality of trying to sell it. And this is not new, and it's not just the Russian idea, but it's what we do as modern societies. We try to sell identities through advertising, and advertising is essentially propaganda. And I just was going to have a few images here to sort of think about the idea of advertising and selling identities and what it all means. This is an advertisement from the 1990s, and it is for a very well-known vodka. Of course, vodka and the Russian idea, this we've already talked about the very large consumption of vodka and the health risks that this overindulgence of vodka has led to in terms of life expectancy for men, for example. But what I find is interesting is you have this 1990s advertisement for vodka, and it's very much playing off of a 1920s campaign, propaganda poster for literacy, for reading. And if you look at these, you can see where there's this very much is paying homage, this vodka ad, to this 1920s campaign on literacy. And there's a great deal of sort of irony, I would think. Again, in terms of vodka, the mother of all vodkas, from the motherland of vodka. I think that Pelevin would have a wonderful time sort of looking at this poster and this advertising campaign and thinking about it. And also the whole meaning of the Tuborg man. You can go online, and I hope you do go and explore some of these advertising campaigns and think about sort of the meaning of all this. I think one of the points with Pelevin and his hyper-realized Muscovite reality is trying to figure out what can you believe in, what is real, what is not real, and this sort of hyper-reality of it all. This wow, wow, wow. And so what do you think the meaning of it is by the end of it? And I also briefly wanted to mention about movies, Generation P and the movies, because there's at least one film I really recommend that you see, and either get a copy of it, go to the library, or stream it. Films begin to pick up and also express this sort of new hyper reality. Initially, because there was no state support for filmmaking after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Russian film industry just bottoms out. There's no money, and the film industry had been state subsidized since the beginning of the Soviet Union, and not only subsidized but controlled. And so the film industry was just another sort of casualty of the collapse of the Soviet Union. But the government has now gotten back into subsidizing and, you could say, controlling the film industry. And we'll look at this when we look at the age of Putin. But Putin really likes Russian movies and likes the sort of Russian idea to be celebrated. The Russian film production, as you can see in the 1990s, it drops from the year 1990 to 300 feature films produced to 1996 to 28 films. It was difficult to get funding to make films, but there were two very successful directors in the 1990s, and there's more, but probably the two most successful is Alexei Balabanov in his movie Brother or Brat, and then there was a follow-up of Brother 2 or Brat 2. And I really recommend seeing at least the first one. The second one is not as good, but Brother, their first one, is a blockbuster hit. And of course, the Nikita Mikhalkov's Burnt by the Sun is also an international smash. And if you haven't seen Burnt by the Sun yet, I really recommend it. It's very sentimental and nostalgic, but also a very beautiful film. And those are two sort of important filmmakers. But in terms of Brother or Brat, there's an excellent article that talks about what happens to filmmaking in the 90s, and I recommend reading that and watching the film and kind of consider, again, this sort of reality that's created, that this new sort of post-Soviet fairy tale and what it tells us about how Russians see themselves. So I hope you enjoy Homo Sapiens, and I don't know if this has helped you think about how it fits into postmodernism and his contemplation of what Soviet propaganda and Western advertising and the Russian idea is all about. It's complicated, but I think you want to keep in mind that he's really playing around with the ideas of a Russia in crisis, in search of its identity, and trying to figure out what to believe in. And the role of technology, particularly the television, is huge in it. So have fun reading it.